Let me tell you about my first experience with mescaline. I remember sitting in my garden in Los Angeles, watching the world transform before me. Colors became more vivid, objects seemed to breathe, and I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The simple folds of my trousers became an aesthetic revelation. It was as if I had removed a veil that had been covering my perception of reality.
Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we travel back in time to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how sensitive people like you and me can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Merijn de Haen, and today we'll be talking to Aldous Huxley. Born in 1894, Aldous Huxley was a renowned English novelist and philosopher. Best known for his dystopian novel Brave New World, Huxley's works span satire, philosophy, and non-fiction. His life was marked by intellectual pursuits and a fascination with mysticism, leaving a lasting impact on 20th century literature. So please welcome to the podcast, Aldous Huxley.
Thank you for having me. It's a true pleasure talking with you.
Could you tell us about your life?
Certainly, I was born into a family steeped in intellectual and scientific tradition. My grandfather, Thomas Huxley, was a prominent biologist and staunch defender of Darwin's theory of evolution. My father was a writer and schoolmaster, and my mother came from a family of scholars. I had an early passion for literature and science, but my life changed dramatically when I developed a severe eye condition as a teenager. For a time, I was nearly blind. This altered the course of my education and ultimately my career. Instead of pursuing science, I turned to literature, studying at Oxford and immersing myself in writing. I became known as a novelist, satirist, and essayist. My most famous work, Brave New World, explored a dystopian future where technology and social conditioning had stripped humanity of its depth and meaning. But I also had deep interests in mysticism, philosophy, and altered states of consciousness, which led me to experiment with psychedelics and explore different spiritual traditions. My later years were spent in the United States, particularly in California, where I delved into Eastern philosophy, psychedelic research, and the potential of human consciousness.
Can you tell us an amusing anecdote from your life?
Well, let me tell you about my first experience with mescaline. It was in 1953, under the supervision of a psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond. I had long been fascinated by consciousness and its expansion, but this experience confirmed many of my suspicions about the mind's untapped potential. I remember sitting in my garden in Los Angeles watching the world transform before me. Colors became more vivid, objects seemed to breathe, and I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The simple folds of my trousers became an aesthetic revelation. It was as if I had removed a veil that had been covering my perception of reality. This experience inspired my book, The Doors of Perception, in which I argued that our ordinary consciousness is only a fraction of what the mind is capable of perceiving. Of course, not everyone appreciated my enthusiasm. Some saw it as reckless or unscientific, but I believed then, as I do now, that we must explore the full spectrum of human consciousness to understand ourselves.
That's fascinating. Can you tell us more about the place you grew up?
I grew up in England, in the countryside of Surrey, specifically at my family's home in Godalming. It was an environment rich in books, discussion, and intellectual stimulation. My father, Leonard, was a schoolmaster at Charterhouse, and my mother, Julia, was deeply involved in progressive education. The house itself was filled with literature, scientific texts, and discussions about philosophy, evolution, and art. My siblings and I were encouraged to think critically and independently. It was a privileged upbringing, in the sense that I had access to great minds and ideas from an early age. But it was also a childhood marked by loss. My mother died when I was young, and my near blindness later forced me into a world of internal contemplation.
That sounds like quite a challenge. Did you always live in England, or did you move to other places at some point in your life?
I moved quite a bit. After my early years in Surrey, I went to Oxford, where I studied English literature at Balliol College. Later, I spent time in London, where I became part of the literary and intellectual circles of the 1920s. Eventually, I left England for good. In the 1930s, I lived in Italy for a while, then in France. But my most significant move was to the United States in 1937. I settled in California, where the climate was kinder to my health, and where I found an openness to ideas that was refreshing. In Los Angeles, I wrote, taught, and explored my growing interests in mysticism, consciousness, and psychedelic substances. California, in many ways, became my intellectual and spiritual home.
Take us on a tour of the places that mattered most to you.
Oxford was formative. It was where I refined my thinking and where literature became my vocation. It was an intense time, full of books, friendships, and intellectual debates. London, in the 1920s, was a world of literary salons and bright young things. I met figures like D.H. Lawrence and T.S. Eliot there. Sanary-sur-Mer, in the south of France, was a sanctuary for me in the 1930s. Many intellectuals fled there from the political turmoil of Europe. There was sunlight, the Mediterranean, and a sense of escape from the chaos of the modern world. And then, of course, California. The hills of Los Angeles, the desert landscapes of the Southwest, the Pacific. These became deeply tied to my later work and thinking. The broad skies and open land felt like an invitation to explore new realms of thought and experience.
Tell us about the intellectual, philosophical, and religious currents of your place and time.
The early 20th century was a time of great upheaval. Science was advancing rapidly, but so was disillusionment, particularly after the First World War. The old belief in progress as an absolute good was crumbling. Writers and thinkers were questioning everything: society, politics, human nature. In literature, there was modernism, Joyce, Woolf, Eliot, all experimenting with form and perception. In science, Freud and Jung were reshaping our understanding of the mind. Meanwhile, totalitarian ideologies were rising, threatening to control not just people's actions, but their very thoughts. Later in life, I became fascinated by Eastern philosophy and mysticism. While the West was focused on external progress, traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism looked inward. I saw great wisdom in their teachings on consciousness and self-transcendence.
Tell us about philosophers or sages that had an influence on you, or to whom you had a relationship of some sort.
William Blake was one of my earliest influences. His idea that perception is limited by mental filters, his doors of perception, resonated deeply with me. I also admired the philosophy of Henri Bergson, who spoke of intuition and the limits of rational thought. I was fascinated by the Vedantic and Buddhist sages, particularly Ramakrishna, and the teachings of the Upanishads. The idea that ultimate reality is beyond our everyday perception, that resonated with my own explorations. I also greatly admired D.H. Lawrence, though we sometimes disagreed. His passion for life, his sense of the body's wisdom. He was a kind of prophet in his own way.
Did you get involved in any controversies?
Oh, quite a few. Brave New World stirred controversy when it was published in 1932. Some critics accused me of cynicism, of exaggerating the dangers of technological progress. Others thought I was attacking socialism, though I was more concerned with the mechanization of human life, whether under capitalism or communism. The book was even banned in some places, which amused me. People often react most strongly to ideas they secretly recognize as plausible. Later, my advocacy for psychedelic substances caused another stir. When I published The Doors of Perception in 1954, many dismissed it as the ramblings of an eccentric. Aldous Huxley, the respected writer, experimenting with drugs, scandalous, but I wasn't interested in mere escapism. I believed these substances could offer genuine insights into the nature of consciousness. And then there was my interest in mysticism and Eastern philosophy. Some of my contemporaries thought I had gone soft, abandoning reason for spirituality. But I never saw science and mysticism as opposites. Both seek truth, just in different ways. I rarely fought these controversies head-on. I preferred to let ideas speak for themselves. In time, many of my so-called radical ideas became mainstream.
Can you tell us about your life lessons?
If I had to distill my thoughts into a lesson, it would be this. Look closely at reality, but never assume you see all of it. Our perceptions are narrow, shaped by biology, culture, and habit. If we wish to live fully, we must find ways to expand them. I believed in intellectual curiosity. One should read widely, explore different perspectives, and resist dogma. But knowledge alone isn't enough. Experience is vital. Whether through meditation, art, nature, or, yes, psychedelics, we must seek direct encounters with reality. Another lesson, beware of comfort. When societies prioritize stability over freedom, efficiency over depth, they risk becoming like Brave New World, shallow, pacified, dehumanized. Progress should serve human flourishing, not reduce us to contented automatons. And finally, kindness. In my later years, I came to see that intellectual brilliance means little without compassion. Understanding the mind is important, but understanding the heart is essential.
How did your thinking stand out from what was already taught in your lifetime?
I straddled two worlds. I was a rationalist, steeped in the Western scientific tradition, but I was also drawn to mysticism. Many intellectuals of my time were either rigid materialists or religious traditionalists. I rejected both extremes. I believed that consciousness itself was a frontier worth exploring, not just through psychology, but through direct experience. I also took a keen interest in the future, especially the potential dangers of technology. Many of my contemporaries were dazzled by progress. I saw its dark side. In Brave New World, I warned that a world obsessed with comfort, consumerism, and control could lead to a kind of voluntary servitude. Today, some might say that vision was rather prescient. And then, of course, my work with psychedelics. At a time when mind-altering substances were associated with delinquency and vice, I argued that they could be tools for insight, even enlightenment. That was a rather unconventional stance.
Your dystopian work, Brave New World, is often mentioned. Rather less mention is made of the more utopian Island, the last novel you wrote. Could you say more about the message you wanted to convey with this book?
Ah, Island. Yes, it is often overshadowed by Brave New World, which I find somewhat ironic, given that the two books were meant to be in dialogue with one another, opposite visions of what human society could become. where Brave New World was a warning, a world where pleasure and efficiency smother the soul, Island was my attempt at imagining a sane society. A place where human beings could flourish not as cogs in a machine, but as conscious, free, and fulfilled individuals. The story takes place on Pala, a fictional island that blends the best aspects of Eastern spirituality and Western science. The people there use mindfulness, education, and even psychedelics, or moksha medicine, to cultivate awareness and deeper understanding. Unlike the shallow hedonism of Brave New World, Pala's pleasures are rooted in presence and meaning. I wanted to show that utopia need not mean stagnation or control. Pala is not perfect, no place ever is, but it is humane. People are taught to see clearly, to balance reason with intuition, technology with wisdom. They use modern medicine but also value nature. They have sex without shame, but also without exploitation. They educate their children not just to memorize facts, but to see, to be fully alive to the world. But of course, utopias are fragile. In the novel, Pala falls to outside forces, greed, power, militarization. This was my way of saying that even the best ideas must defend themselves against the brutal realities of history. In a way, Island was my final statement of hope. I spent my life warning about the dangers of dehumanization, but I also believed in the possibility of something better. I wanted to leave my readers not with despair, but with a vision of what we could be, if only we chose to awaken.
It's interesting because I've read the book another way. That it is, of course, possible to imagine or even create an ideal society, but that the darker forces of humanity would inevitably force out the higher intentions. Humanity would eventually be equalized along the lines of the profit motive and the extractive paradigm of nature. That indeed, the head would always win out over the heart. Ultimately, for me, Island was less about hope and more about grim dystopian realism.
That is a compelling reading, and I wouldn't necessarily argue against it. In fact, I suspected as much when I wrote Island, that even if we could create a society of wisdom and balance, the world beyond it might not allow such an experiment to endure. Pala, for all its beauty, is vulnerable, not because its philosophy is flawed, but because it exists in a world where power, greed, and exploitation are the dominant forces. The ending of the book is undeniably tragic. The island is overrun by the forces of industry and militarism, what you might call the extractive paradigm. The head does indeed crush the heart. So in that sense, Island is dystopian, not in its internal vision, but in its fate. Perhaps it was my way of saying, even if we discover the path to a better way of living, will we have the strength to defend it? Or will the machinery of history, the relentless march of power and commerce, always consume such fragile experiments? It is a bitter question, and one I do not claim to have answered. But I suppose I wanted to leave a possibility open that even if utopia is fleeting, even if it is doomed to be crushed, it is still worth imagining. If nothing else, it gives us a measure of what we have lost and what we might yet strive for.
Thinking about it a bit further, it seems a bit harsh of me to call the extractive paradigm and the profit motive dark. After all, they have given rise to an unprecedented increase in both human population numbers and collective well-being. Is it the highest possible human attainment? Perhaps not, but I do find it a bit unsportsmanlike to call the extractive paradigm dark in view of its proven benefits.
A fair and nuanced reflection. The extractive paradigm, capitalism, industrialization, the relentless drive for expansion, has indeed yielded extraordinary benefits. It has lifted billions out of poverty, extended lifespans, and granted us technological wonders once unimaginable. In purely material terms, it has been an astonishing success, but I would argue that success in one dimension does not mean success in all. Yes, we have more food, more medicine, more comforts, but do we have more wisdom, more meaning, more connection to one another and to the world? That is where my concern lies. The issue is not that the extractive paradigm is evil, it is simply blind. It operates according to a single logic: growth, efficiency, accumulation. These are not inherently bad things, but without counterbalancing forces, compassion, sustainability, depth, they can become destructive. A system that prizes only expansion and profit may improve material conditions, but at what cost to the human spirit? This is the tension at the heart of Island and Brave New World. The question is not whether we should reject technology, industry, or progress outright, but whether we can use them wisely, whether we can integrate material well-being with psychological and spiritual flourishing. So no, I wouldn't call the extractive paradigm dark. I would call it incomplete. And the danger is that, left unchecked, it may crowd out the very things that make life truly worth living.
That is a wise reflection. Also, when you take into account the ability of humanity to be stewards of our planet, some degree of wisdom is perhaps possible or even expected of us, given our big brains.
Yes, precisely. Our intelligence has given us the power to reshape the world on an unprecedented scale, but with that power comes responsibility, something we have been slow to embrace. We have used our big brains to extract, to dominate, to maximize short-term gains. But can we also use them to sustain, to harmonize, to think in longer, deeper cycles? That remains to be seen. Stewardship requires a shift in perspective. The extractive paradigm assumes that nature is a resource to be used. A wiser approach would see nature as a living system in which we are participants, not masters. This is one of the lessons I tried to weave into Island, the idea that humans can live in balance with their environment rather than merely exploiting it. You are right to suggest that some degree of wisdom is possible. After all, despite our flaws, we are also capable of art, love, curiosity, and self-reflection. The question is, will we cultivate these capacities before it is too late? Or will we allow our cleverness to outstrip our wisdom until we have built a world too barren, too artificial, too controlled to nourish the deeper needs of the human soul? I have always believed that we can choose a wiser path. The problem is not lack of intelligence, but lack of vision. And vision is something we must actively cultivate through education, through awareness, through the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be human.
So let's bring it together. How can your teachings be relevant for sensitive individuals who worry about the uncertainties of life?
Uncertainty, the great anxiety of modern existence. The world changes rapidly, institutions crumble, traditions fade. Many feel lost, adrift. First, I would say, do not fear uncertainty, embrace it. Reality is not fixed, and neither are you. Instead of seeking rigid answers, cultivate a mind that is flexible, open, and exploratory. Read widely, travel if you can, expose yourself to different ways of thinking. The key, I think, is to shift the relationship to uncertainty. Rather than fearing it, one might learn to work with it, to see it as a teacher rather than a threat. In Pala, the people practice mindfulness, not as a retreat from the world, but as a way to engage with it more fully. They train themselves to observe without clinging, to accept change without being shattered by it. This is something sensitive individuals might find useful. Another approach is participation. It is easy to feel helpless in the face of large-scale uncertainty, but even small acts of engagement, whether in art, in conversation, in community, can restore a sense of agency. The world is uncertain, yes, but it is also still unfolding, still malleable. Sensitivity, rather than being a weakness, can be a tool for shaping it wisely. And finally, there is beauty. Art, music, poetry, these are not luxuries, but necessities. They remind us that life is not just about survival, but about meaning. No matter how uncertain or chaotic the world becomes, there will always be moments of clarity, a poem, a sunset, the laughter of a friend. These things remind us that existence is not merely a problem to be solved, but an experience to be lived. If uncertainty is inevitable, then let it be met with awareness, with courage, and, when possible, with joy.
Tell us about your death.
Well, I departed this world on November 22nd, 1963. A rather eventful day, though not because of me. President Kennedy was assassinated that same morning, overshadowing my passing. Not that I minded. Death, after all, is merely another transition. By then, I had accepted my fate. I had been suffering from cancer for some time. On my final day, unable to speak, I wrote a simple request to my wife, Laura. LSD 100 micrograms intramuscular. She understood. She administered the dose. As I drifted away, I felt no fear. Only a great expansion, a dissolving of the self into something vast, ineffable. It was, I think, a fitting farewell.
What else do you think I should know?
Perhaps this. The world is neither as simple nor as solid as it seems. The boundaries we assume between self and other, reality and illusion, mind and matter, are more fluid than we think. Question them. Explore them. Play with them. Also be wary of utopias. Perfect societies, whether built on technology, ideology, or pleasure, often come at the cost of individuality. True freedom lies not in comfort, but in depth, in the full, messy, unpredictable spectrum of human experience.
As we approach the end of our interview, is there anything we have missed about your life?
Perhaps it is not the details of my life that matter, but the questions I leave behind. How can we remain human in an increasingly mechanized world? How can we expand our awareness without losing ourselves? What does it truly mean to see? Keep your mind open, but not so open that it loses all shape. Seek truth, but remember, truth is often stranger, deeper, and more beautiful than we imagine. And above all, stay awake. The world is full of wonders, but only if we choose to see them.
Thank you very much, Aldous Huxley, for your words of wisdom.
It's been my pleasure, Merijn.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Undead Sages podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your friends, rate the episode, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast.